With that, I'll turn it over to Lisa and Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Nelson, and thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. For the record, Aaron Gutierrez from the Office of the State Actuary, and sitting next to me is Lisa Wan, also from our office, one of our actuaries. As the Director just mentioned, we 2 months ago had given an educational presentation on the actuarial funding methods. Quick recap of that, there are different funding methods with different pros and cons. The current left-to funding method is using parts of 2 different funding methods, the aggregate funding method and the entry age normal funding method. Now that combination of funding methods does not allow for an unfunded actuarial accrued liability, and it manages the contribution rate volatility in 2 different ways. First off, by having a rate floor, and second, by having an asset smoothing method in place. And so that's a perfect transition into today's presentation. I'll start off with talking about some of the theoretical things about what is an asset smoothing method, why you might want one, and what are some of the considerations for choosing a method. Then I'll be handing it over to Lisa to talk about how that method works in Washington and some comparison of some different funding, comparison of different asset smoothing method options. So beginning with what is a smoothing method, at its core, we're talking about a way to manage the short-term volatility in the investment market and a way to provide more stable contribution rates. Essentially what's happening is anytime the actual rate of return is a certain threshold, above or below a certain threshold around the around the expected rate of return, then a portion of that return is going to be spread out over a longer time horizon. There's lots of different ways that you could structure your smoothing method. There's a lot of different professional opinions on this about which measures should be smoothed, what length of time this should be done over. Should it be over years? Should it be over decades? And there's a lot of disagreement on whether or not smoothing should take place at all. For the most part, as a practical matter, we're typically referring to a set portion of returns being amortized over less than a decade. A very basic graphical example of how smoothing can work. What we did, wanted to take something that was outside of the plan, just a very generic example. So what we've got here is the S&P 500 returns from going back to 1980. And as you can see, fairly smooth at the beginning. The lighter blue line, I think they're both blue, but maybe that's blue and black. The blue line is fairly smooth up to about the mid-90s, then goes up a much more sharp angle. Then, of course, you can see at some point it enters that sort of sawtooth pattern. So to show how a smoothing method could work, we took those returns and applied a fixed 8-year smoothing method to them. And you can see that black line, or the really dark blue line, is a much more smooth line moving up towards the same basic direction. So what are the considerations when choosing a funding method? First of all, just like we talked about with the funding method presentation, the asset smoothing method is really just one big piece of your overall funding method. And so you want to make sure that all these pieces are going to be working together in harmony. Constancy is also important, a long-term choice. That doesn't mean that you can't make adjustments to the smoothing method, just that if you make too many adjustments, if you do it too often, there's a danger that it could be used to shop for the results that are favorable to your conditions or to the plan conditions. Also, it's important to consult with your plan actuary. First off, the board is required under state law, and also I believe it was under the initial initiative, to consult with an actuary. It doesn't necessarily have to be our office, but the board is required to consult with an actuary. And so that actuary is going to need to comment on the reasonability of the decisions and the funding methods and the results. And the actuaries are going to be guided by these things called the Actuarial Standards of Practice, or ASOPs. Now, these are not black and white rules, but they do set guidance for actuaries. So some of the things that they'll be expected to comment on, first off, the consistent treatment of actuarial gains and losses. it's important not to for example, recognize all the gains immediately or and defer all of the losses over time. It's expected that both the gains and losses will be treated equally. Also, the assets will need to fall within a reasonable range, what we typically call a corridor. So if you take your whatever your market value is, at some point there's typically going to be like a floor and a ceiling above and below that the actuarial value cannot exceed. I mentioned earlier that you have a choice of how long you want to defer any impacts, but the actuaries are going to be expected to comment on whether or not that choice of time is a reasonable one. Whether it's 3 years, 10 years, whatever, the actuaries will be expected to comment on that. To what degree would you want to smooth the assets? Again, there's lots of different combinations, lots of different options available. Again, you can take many different lengths of time. The typical range we see for this sort of thing is between 3 to 10 years. The corridor I mentioned earlier, we typically see a corridor of somewhere between plus or minus 20 to 30%. So based on your market value, anywhere from the actuarial value could be anywhere from about 80% of the market value up to 120% of the market value, or 70 to 130, somewhere in that range. You also have an option of either fixed or dynamic smoothing method. Now, in a fixed method, it's fairly straightforward. All the gains and losses would be smoothed over a fixed percentage of time. Typically, what we see for something like that is somewhere around 5 years. But it's also possible to do a dynamic smoothing method similar to what the board has in place right now. In other words, the bigger the impact, the longer it takes for you to absorb that impact. With that, I'd like to hand off to Lisa to talk about Washington. Oh, sure.
Actually, I'm going to get into that in just a moment, if you don't mind. Perfect. It was perfect. Thank you. So, yes. Sure. Why don't I start with that, and then we'll move into the other question about the funding, the smoothing method for left 2. So that was the first slide that Aaron introduced, which was a recap from the first educational piece, and the there's different funding methods available, and the aggregate funding method, which is the core or base funding method for left 2, does not allow for an unfunded actuarial accrued liability. It basically, the funding method just doesn't have that in it. And that's one of the benefits of the program that left 2 has adopted. Any more questions on that one? So what that means is whenever there's gains and losses, they get immediately recognized, except for this smoothing method. They get immediately recognized and built into the contributions and paid for over the salary of the current members.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. So moving back to the smoothing method, in Washington State, the smoothing depends on the size of the change in that gain or loss. So as Aaron mentioned, there's a fixed smoothing method option or dynamic, and for Washington State, the dynamic method has been adopted. And what that means is the larger the gain or loss in a year, the longer you smooth that. More time to defer it and recognize it. Washington also has those boundaries that Aaron talked about, the corridor, and it is a 30% corridor for Washington. So the actuarial value cannot fall below 70% of the market value in any valuation, any snapshot in time, and it cannot exceed 130%. And we'll see that corridor a little bit later in this presentation with a graph. We've also included in there the actual wording from the RCW that explains how this asset smoothing method works for Washington. So we've also provided here the schedule of asset smoothing for left 2, and this table is in your actuarial valuation report. And I'll just try to explain a little bit of how this works. If you look at the highlighted row right in the middle, if your actual return in a given year that we're doing the valuation falls within 1% on either side of your expected return being 7.5%, then the assets, the actuarial gain or loss is smoothed over 1 year. In other words, it's recognized immediately. So if it's a small gain or loss within 1%, we're going to recognize it immediately in your actuarial value of assets. Then if you look at the row above that, if your actual return is within 1 to 2% of your expected, so 8.5 to 9.5, then we're going to smooth that over 2 years, basically divide that total gain loss by 2. And half of it will be recognized immediately, the rest will be recognized the next year. And then as you continue going outside, you can see every 1% increment, we're going to defer it an extra year, smooth it over an extra year. And by applying this smoothing method to the investment gains and losses, it produces this actuarial value of assets. And that's what we use for determining your funded status and also calculating contribution rates. So the smoothing becomes your new asset value that's used for your funded status and your contribution rates, and that's how we get some additional stability in those contribution rates. So we start with the market value of assets. We subtract the total deferred asset gains and losses to come up with your actuarial value of assets. Those total deferred gains and losses are your prior deferrals that have been rolled forward a year plus that year's deferred amount. And we'll go through an actual calculation because that's fun. Then when we get to that actual value of assets, then we also apply that corridor. So we make sure it's within 70 to 130% of that market value. And that gets back to that actuarial standard of practice that Aaron talked about, that your actuarial value needs to have a reasonable or should have a reasonable relationship to the market value. And that's how we determine that. So here's another chart that comes right out of your valuation report. And this is the development of the actuarial value of assets. And we'll just kind of look at the big numbers because we're going to break this down a little bit, this chart for you. So again, we start with the market value up there at the top, $6.6 billion. Then we subtract the total deferred asset gains and losses, so the rolled forward from the previous year plus adding on that current year, the 2012 amount. And that gets us to the starting point actuarial value of assets. Then we look at that corridor, the 70, 130%. Does that number fall within it? Yes. Okay, that's our new number. So we end up with an actuarial value of assets at this point in time, the June 30th, 2012 valuation of $7.2 billion, because we're still deferring at this point almost $600 million. Yes.
Lisa, is the 70-30 a more liberal corridor than the 80-20 would be as far as?
It is, but it also is consistent with a little bit longer deferral period. So we tend to see a 20% corridor more with a 5-year smoothing and then a little bit longer corridor with a longer smoothing period. So I also thought I'd give you the math behind that deferral calculation in case you're interested and you could actually work this all through yourself and see how it works. So bear with me, and we'll take a look at what I've got here are 3 fiscal year numbers that correspond to numbers that were in that chart we just looked at. So in 2010, the 2010 valuation, the actual return that year for Left Plan 2 was almost a 13% return. At that point, the expected return was 8%. So we almost had almost 5% gain on assets that year from expected, which translated to a 5-year deferral, 5-year smoothing. The actual gain was $219 million. When you smooth that over 5 years, it means you're going to recognize annually about $44 million with rounding. So we recognized 1 year of it in 2010, 1 year in 2011, 1 year in the 2012, the current valuation. So at that point in time, we've recognized 3 years now. That means we still have 2 years remaining, which means we're deferring, with rounding, $87 million at that point, at the June 30th 2012 valuation. Okay? So same thing if you look at 2011, that gain was more than 8% from your expected, so the maximum is an 8-year smoothing. And then in 2012, we actually had a loss on the assets, and in this case, it was between 6 and 7%, so it was a 7-year smoothing, and there's all the numbers related to that year. So in the 2012 valuation, we're going to recognize 1 year of that 2012 loss. And then you can see how those numbers flow right through this table that I showed you in a prior slide. So I've highlighted the 2010, 11, 12 that we just talked about. So that gets, every year that happens, we roll forward what we've been deferring, we add in that current year's results, and that gives us our total amount we're deferring at the valuation date. So we also wanted to show you an example of the market value versus actuarial value, similar to what Aaron showed earlier, but this is actually LEF 2's results. So you can see that in the middle of those lines that we've got a lot of blue colors on there. The middle blue line that's got the more volatility is your market value of assets. You can see the corresponding lines up and above and below, which is the corridor. Okay, so your actuarial value will always have to fall within that corridor. And then you can see that very smooth line, which represents your actuarial value. And you can see that when your assets are used to calculate your contribution rates, when you've got that volatility, that up and down, that's going to translate to your contribution rates. So the smoothing method provides that more smoother transition of your assets through that period of time, which results in more smooth contribution rates. And out in the later years, they converge because that's where we are expecting the 7.5% return those years. And they converge at the time that we've now recognized all past deferred amounts. And now we're getting an expected 7.5% return in those later years.
Lisa, could you go back one slide?
Sure.
So looking at this slide, that's the current amounts from the most recent valuation.
Correct.
So if there's still $1 billion in deferred losses from 2008 and 2009 yet to be recognized in Left Plan 2.
Correct.
And that's why overall we still have $581 million in losses yet to be recognized.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
Got that all right. And one last thing just to point out on this this graph, you can see that in 2009 when we did have that large asset loss, the market value came way down. We didn't recognize all that loss in 1 year because of the smoothing method and the deferral. The actuarial value of assets for Left Plan 2 almost hit the corridor. I think it was 1%. I think it was 129% of the market value, so almost hit that corridor. So now we just want to take a few minutes and look at a couple of hypothetical smoothing methods in relation to what Left Plan 2 has in place right now. So first we're going to look at no asset smoothing. So all the gains and losses are recognized immediately. There's no deferral of any gains and losses. We're also going to look at a 5-year fixed smoothing where every actuarial gain and loss every year no matter how large or small it is deferred for is smoothed over a 5-year period, and a 20% corridor in place. So that 80 to 120% market value corridor, and then comparing to left plan 2 again, which is the 8-year graded smoothing. So this chart shows, and these are estimated, we have to make a lot of assumptions when we're going to go back in time and apply a different smoothing method. So they're just estimates, just to give you an idea of what contribution rates would look like if, one, we had the no asset smoothing, so basically what the volatility we are seeing in that market value translates to volatility in the contribution rates. And then the 5-year fixed smoothing has a little less volatility, and the 8-year is even a little smoother. So this gives you an idea of what resulting contribution rates would have looked like. I wanted to point out one very important thing. When we did these calculations, there are no rate floors in place, because if we applied the rate floor, you wouldn't be able to see what a smoothing method is really doing. So for left plan 2, if we look at this period of time, you were always at the rate floor. So an asset smoothing method really would only be limiting your upward volatility. Okay, so because you've got that rate floor and that's where your contributions have been, the asset smoothing method really isn't doing anything in that period of time unless assets go up and cause contribution rates to go above your rate floor. Then the asset smoothing starts to limit that upward volatility.
Sorry, I have all the questions here.
Okay.
And what is our current rate floor right now?
The rate floor that's been adopted for long-term policy is 90% of the entry age normal cost rate, but the board has also adopted for in a short-term period 100%.
What percentage rate is that? I mean, so if I was to look at this chart, it's around that no less than 7.5%, 8%. Is that what we're looking at, or what? How does that rate to these contribution rates?
The ones that we're showing in this chart do not have the rate floor applied, because for us to be able to show you what the different smoothing methods could do to your contribution rates, we had to remove that rate floor. So I believe the rate was just below 8 during most of this historical period. Is that right, Steve?
The board adopted the time the board was created, the rate would have that was being paid by the members was around closer to 5. Mm-hmm. The board adopted a policy to gradually move that up to the normal cost rate and then hold it steady at the normal cost rate, which right now is a little bit over 8.
Right. That's what I was expecting was that you could just draw a straight line around that 8% plus or minus, and this would have just shown you that if we just let it float, it could have gone as low as, on this chart, 2.5% and as high as 9.5% or something like that. Right. If we hadn't had those floors in place at the time. Right.
That's correct. Under these example smoothing methods, yes. So in summary, the asset smoothing method helps to manage that short-term volatility in investment gains and losses, which we know, market value can be very volatile from year to year. And that smoothing of that volatility also promotes stable contribution rates. As Aaron talked earlier in the presentation, there are many options available for a smoothing method, and selecting one includes considerations for your whole funding method. How is that integrating with the rest of your funding method? As Aaron talked about, the constancy, that sort of more long-term view of it. It's not something you want to be changing like every couple of years, and also including guidance from your plan actuary. As we prepare an actuarial valuation report, we do have to comment on the reasonableness of things that are in law, that we're not involved necessarily in making the decisions on some components of your funding method. We have to comment on the reasonableness of those. And in Washington, the smoothing method depends on the size of the change, so that dynamic that Aaron talked about, and the length of smoothing will not exceed 8 years, so from 1 to 8 years, and that 30% corridor that's in place. And that concludes our presentation, and we're willing to take any questions.
I think I know the answer, but I'm doing a self-test. So if the value of the assets go outside the corridor, it was 129%, say it went to 138%, then what happens?
Then the actuarial value would equal that 130% of market value. So the actuarial value would have been set at that 130% of market value. So if it was 132%, it would have been brought down to 130%, and that would have been the asset value that would have been used to calculate your funded status, your contribution rates. We'd continue those deferrals, continue to carry them through, but we wouldn't let that actuarial value go outside of that corridor.
But follow up on, Mark, I think what you're asking is that we would have to do something with rates. Isn't there, if we get down to those borders, we have to do, and then it calls us to do something about that, which is mainly about future contribution rates, right? I mean, if we get down to those corridors, then we need to do something else to make the plan whole again.
No, once you get to the corridor, that's just for setting that actuarial value of assets that goes into the calculation for the contribution rate.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't require like any decision by the board. It doesn't require you to make any adjustments. It's just how much is being deferred and recognized, and it just gets limited.
Yeah, it would, in the case that you were talking about with 129 to 138, it would have forced you to recognize that 8% of losses, which would have resulted in higher contribution rates, because you would have had to, you couldn't smooth that extra 8%. You'd have to recognize it and start paying for it.
That's right.
To stay in the corridor.
David?
So I know this is information only, and you started off by Steve saying that, do we have adopted policies that we're using the 8-year smoothing method, and this is a question of should we change that policy? And everything I'm hearing is that steady as she goes. I mean, 8 years seems to be working well, and stay there.
Yeah, it was the current smoothing policy was set in statute. It has been being used by the board since the board was created. It was set in statute before the creation of the board. So this was one of the purposes of this was to check in with you. You are responsible for the smoothing method used in Left 2 and give you a chance to evaluate how you feel about the adequacy of the current methods. If you had any questions or any concerns about it, then we could follow up with that in terms of providing options or something like that for a potential change. But that slide that you had, Lisa, that showed the actual smooth returns using the dynamic, I think you saw that the smoothing method that's been used has actually been, judging by that, very successful. Now, there are pros and cons. One of the cons is you still have $581 million in losses. $1 billion of the losses from 2008 and 2009 you're still paying for. But so that's one of the cons. A shorter smoothing method, you would have had a 5-year smoothing method, you would have had that all paid for by now. But on the flip side, your rates have been extraordinarily stable. We've had part of the reason, one of the reasons for rate stability being a goal of the board was if rates are stable, studies show the sponsors tend to be more willing to pay the rates. And you have received your annual required contributions from the members and from the employers every year, and it's been a little bit rough and tumble at times, but you've also got the required contributions from the state every year, so not without some work. But as a result, you've been very successful, and so when you judge the plan by how stable your rates are, the percentage of the annual required contributions being committed, and even judging the funding status by a market value, not the smooth value, by all of those standards, anyone, I think, would judge your plan as being very successful. Lisa showed you at the last presentation a slide comparing how your the different funding methods and how they've worked. I think the funding methods that you've used to kind of navigate 2008 and 2009, and again, the smoothing method's a part of that, as she said today. The results kind of speak for themselves. There may come a time where you're more interested in changing it. And Allison's presentation following up on this will be timely as well, because one of the, if your goal is rate stability, one of the things that can make that a challenge is investment return volatility and how you manage that. And so that's one of the things that Allison's going to be talking about, how the SIB portfolio creates or doesn't create investment return volatility. At least judging by the results over the last 10 years, it's hard to find fault with the current smoothing method.
Okay, any other questions? All right, Mayor and Lisa, thank you very much.